Morning everyone. So we are on chapter 6 of Sky's Song. Without further ado, we are back to Flint again. Flint woke to the sunlight streaming through the cracks in the moss and the timber. Normally, he would have welcomed the dawn after so many months of darkness, but now it felt like a warning. They didn't have long to halt the Ice Queen's quest for immortality. He swung out of bed and glanced at Esker. She was still asleep, and to Flint's surprise and irritation, he saw that Pebble was curled up in a ball at the bottom of her bed, not his. She's even bothersome in her sleep, Flint thought to himself, scooping the fox pup into his arms and tiptoeing out of the hut. The dogs yapped from the outhouse, and only when Flint pulled back the mound of stones he'd placed over his catch and tossed them a fish to share did they hush. The dwarf willows either side of the river were cloaked in white, but the sky above was a brilliant blue, and, as Flint listened, he could hear the soft flump of snow sliding off branches and the pop and crack of river ice melting. Spring was in full swing, and Flint knew that the river was not to be trusted as a way across the driftlands when the temperatures began to climb. He gathered up an armful of branches, tried his best not to think about what Tomkin might say if he declared, when home, that he was a warrior who believed in magic, and laid them out of sight behind the hut. Before long he had a fire going, and with his anything knife he pierced chunks of the second salmon he had caught and held them above the flames to cook. Esker shuffled through the snow towards him. "You should have woken me," she whispered. "I would have got in the way," Flint said. "Help with the fire." Flint shrugged. "Quicker on my own." He held out a scoop of bark laden with fish, and Esker shovelled mouthful after mouthful down. Flint raised an eyebrow. "You'd think you hadn't eaten in a year." "I haven't," Esker replied. "Not since the Ice Queen locked me in the music box. It wasn't food or water that kept me alive, just her dark magic." Flint wanted to ask more. Despite what he might have said, magic in its all forms fascinated him. But he was still cross and suspicious of Esker, so he caught himself just before the words slipped out and threw her a death stare instead. Ooh. Esker was too busy enjoying eating to notice. "Last night I watched you cut a hole in the river ice and plunge your spear in," she said between bites. "Then it looked like you were muttering something, but from inside the hut I couldn't hear anything. What were you saying?" Flint looked up. "You were watching me? I thought you were asleep." Esker shook her head. "I figured watching and listening were probably the best ways to learn about hunting." She paused. "I don't imagine I'd be a particularly good hunter. I've not had much experience jamming spears into things, but hopefully I'll pick it up after a while." Her eyes brightened. "Like I did with the break on the sled." Flint squinted. The only reason the sled hadn't careered off was because he had stamped his boot over Esker's. There was no way she'd have had the strength to hold it on her own. He looked at her gaunt face and straggled hair and the furs that almost swallowed her body. Nothing about the girl was geared up for the wild, and before he could stop himself, he found he was offering her advice. "There are rituals attached to hunting, and the tribes always honour them," he said. "First you thank the North Star, the sky god who breathed life into Erkenwald." He stopped suddenly, catching himself. No one thanked the sky gods anymore, but he did, because despite what he had told Esker earlier, he still believed in the gods. How could he not, when he could feel their magic hovering over their kingdom? Flint cleared his throat. He hadn't known this girl long, but it seemed to be annoyingly difficult to steer conversations in the direction he wanted with Esker. Her voice had a habit of drawing surprising and often unfortunate things out of him. He decided to move on quickly. "Then, you thank the animal itself for giving up its life for you. An animal chooses its own death. You see, it chooses the hunter to whom it will submit." He ran a hand down Pebble's back. "There's a bond between animals and tribes out here." Esker breathed, a sigh of relief. "That's good to know, because if the bonds between the tribes are all broken, you'll probably want the animals to hold things together." Flint narrowed his eyes at Esker. There was a mad sort of logic to her, and he wasn't sure whether he liked it. Before he could reply, though, Pebble slipped from his side, poked his nose under Esker's elbow, and gobbled up the last of her fish. Flint smirked as Pebble waddled back to him and crawled into his lap. "You've got to watch your food when Pebble's around." Flint threw a handful of snow on the fire, and it fizzled out. "His appetite is out of control." Esker followed Flint back towards the hut. "How did you and Pebble meet?" she asked, hurrying to keep up. "Was it on a hunt and Pebble refused to choose his own death? Maybe he felt he had more eating to do before he submitted to a hunter. There was a snuffle grunt from the ball of white fur tucked inside Flint's hood that sounded quite like a chuckle. "Found him in our camp scavenging for food," Flint replied, but he made sure he didn't meet Esker's eyes because that wasn't what had happened at all. Shortly afterwards, they were back on the sled racing between the dwarf willows and the drifts of snow as they travelled further and further south. Flint shivered as the first notes of the Ice Queen's anthem floated over the land. The choir was ever so slightly louder with each day that passed, and Flint grimaced. Now he knew why. Had the Ice Queen already stolen his Ma's voice? Would he ever be able to get it back for her? Flint focused on his sled to stop his thoughts spiralling, keeping the river to his right and watching as Esker's eyes travelled beyond that to the mighty Nevercliffs in the distance. A sprawl of jagged peaks locked in the harsh white glitter of snow. Now and then she gasped and pointed at things, and mostly Flint ignored her. But when her gaze shifted to the trees a few miles away, he knew a conversation was inevitable. The trees were not small and straggly like the willow shrubs around them. They were tall and bold, the type of trees you could start climbing at sunrise and only reach the top of when the first stars showed. And, as Flint saw them, a smile spread over his face too. "Deep roots," he said. "The start of it, anyway. There are spruce trees here older than Erkenwald's glaciers, with roots that stretch so far into the earth they reach depths even the whales in the oceans know nothing of." Esker gulped. "So, where exactly will you take me after we've spoken to your brother?" For a second, Flint felt a stab of regret that he had planned to leave Esker in the forest. It would be fun showing someone other than his little sister his secret laboratory up in the trees and all the inventions stored in there. But then he remembered his failed rescue mission and the danger of detours, and he banished the thought from his head. "I haven't decided yet," he said. He steered his sled between the willows, which had grown denser and taller now the forest was in sight. Then, without warning, the dogs swerved and backed up in their tracks. The sled stopped and Flint peered ahead. "What is it?" Esker whispered. Flint secured the brake and stepped off the runners, clutching his anything knife in a shaking hand. Then he crept over the snow until he was level with the dogs. There was a scuffling sound from behind a willow and a high-pitched cry that made Esker jump. Flint edged forward, and there, huddled under the branches of the tree, was a very large bird. He slipped his knife back into the sheath. "A golden eagle," he said as Esker tiptoed closer. "Female, it looks like. They grow much bigger than the male, and this one is huge." He nodded to the wire encircling the bird's talon. It was attached to a chain that had been tied round the trunk of the willow. "It's got itself trapped in a fox's snare." The bird flung its body back from the snare, then flapped its wings against the snow. They were vast, those wings, and flecked with brown, black and gold feathers. But the snare didn't loosen, and after another failed tussle, the eagle jabbed at the wire with its hooked beak. "We have to help her," Esker whispered. Flint looked up at Deep Roots. Tompkin would have noticed he was gone by now. He'd be worried, and so would his sister, Blue. "Even if we free the eagle, it won't survive. Its talons probably crushed, and it'll need to hunt." Flint tugged at her sleeve. "Let's go." But Esker stayed where she was, crouched opposite the eagle, and the girl and the bird stared at each other for several seconds. Flint had seen eagles before, but never this close. Its eyes seemed to burn like desert sand, and there was something in the way it looked at Esker, as if it was seeing things that perhaps he had missed. Shaking himself, Flint turned away, but a few seconds later the eagle began to hiss and flap. Flint whirled around to see Esker bent over the snare, her mittens laid down on the snow beside her. The eagle's wings thrashed against her back, nearly knocking her over, but she didn't back away. She kept close to the bird, her fingers working at the trap, and for a moment Flint thought how natural Esker looked alongside the eagle. Wild animals were hard to approach, even harder to help, but Esker was right there beside this bird, as if, just possibly, she had tended to wild animals before. He strode towards her. "What are you doing? Those wings could break your arm." The eagle yanked back, shrieking, but Esker had managed to loosen the loop of the wire a little, and in a flurry of snow and feathers the eagle burst free, tumbling over itself before stilling a few metres from Esker. "Go on now," she panted. "You're free." The eagle blinked at Esker, its golden head cocked to one side, then it limped beyond another tree, trailing its tail feathers out of sight. Esker stood up and looked at Flint. "Like you said, there's a bond between animals and people out here." Flint said nothing for a moment, then he dragged Esker back to the sled. "Get on, we can't afford any more detours." But, although Flint kept his eyes trained on the trees ahead as they raced towards Deep Roots, He was sharply aware of two things. Eska had shown she had more knowledge of the wild than she had realised, and the eagle she had freed was still watching them from back among the willows. Chapter 7. Eska. There was a hushed kind of silence inside the forest. Flint's dogs nipped this way and that between the trunks. They knew their path instinctively, and they could tell they were almost home. But as Eska was pulled deeper and deeper into the trees, she bit her lip. This was a place that smelled of secrets, and if she didn't manage to win over Tompkin, she'd be left to find her own way here. She pointed to a line of large clawed animal tracks leading into the trees. What made those? Grizzly bear, Flint replied. Eska shuddered. The dogs ran on and on until eventually the trees grew so close together there was no longer a clear path through. Flint unhitched his sled, then dragged it and his huskies towards a large spruce tree. Eska frowned. This tree looked just like all the others, but as Flint slid his bear claw earring out and slotted it into a crack in the wood, Eska's eyes grew large. There was a click, then a door swung inwards, and as it did so, Flint's dogs rushed through, and Eska watched, open-mouthed, as all 7 of them disappeared. Their footsteps pattering into silence, she raised a mitten to her mouth. The tree was entirely hollow. You could fit 6 people inside it, and there was a lamp burning in a bracket on the far side. "Where have they gone?" Eska gasped. Flint grinned, and for a moment it seemed to Eska that he had forgotten to be cross with her. He hauled the sled inside the tree, and as Eska peered closer, she saw him hang it on a hook on the inside wall. "Have you checked for bears?" she whispered. "Just get inside," Flint hissed, and he closed the door behind them. "Welcome to the labyrinth." He motioned for Eska to stay where she was, then he hurried down some earthen steps and returned a few minutes later. "The dogs sleep in kennels down below. They don't much like heights except Pebble, but the rest of the fur tribe," Flint winked, "we go up." Eska wiggled her toes inside her boots. Warmth, safety, and the possibility of friends. Her body tingled at the thought of it all. Flint grabbed hold of the rope ladder hanging down in front of them and placed a boot on the first rung. He climbed a few steps, then glanced back. "Don't say we talked about inventions or magic," he paused, "or the sky gods." Eska clutched the rope. "What shall I say we talked about instead, then, if they ask?" "Spears." Flint glanced up at the ladder. "And, killing things." Eska climbed beneath Flint, rung after rung, until she felt sure the tree couldn't possibly go any higher. But on it went, tiny lamps flickering from the wooden walls around them. Eska tried to plan her words as best as she could so that Tompkin might listen and understand when he saw her. Then she realised how high up she was and began concentrating extremely hard on Pebble's head, bouncing up and down in Flint's hood to avoid catching sight of the long drop down. She stopped dead. There were whispers coming from above. It sounded like 2 boys. "It's Flint," the first said. "He's back." A second voice echoed down the tree. "Let me see, Lofty, shift over." "Ow!" Inch. "You're standing on my hand." There was a scuffle, then 2 faces peered over the edge of a wooden platform that ran around the inside of the tree. Eska craned her head to get a better view. The boys' faces were identical, ruddy cheeks, curly brown hair, matching porcupine quill earrings. Perhaps they were twins. But from what she could see, they had very different physiques. Where one was long and thin, the other was small and plump. Lofty and Inch, Eska mused. It makes sense. Inch squinted towards the ladder. "There's someone else with him." There was a pause, then Lofty's voice came hard and low. "It's a girl! An outsider! By the looks of things." Eska's knuckles whitened round the rope, but she kept on climbing. Then Flint clambered onto the platform, and as Eska followed, panting, the twins backed away from the ladder. The hollow tree closed several metres above their heads, and Eska noticed pieces of the bark nailed to the walls, each one bearing carved words: Otter Tread, Silent Claw, Lone Link, Spruce Wanderer, Wild Paw. Perhaps the names here belonged to former fur tribe chiefs and chieftainesses. There was a desk, too, sculpted from wood, with bears, lynx and otters carved into the legs, and a lantern framed by caribou antlers. These were beautiful, homely things, and Eska felt she could have spent ages looking at them, had it not been for Lofty's and Inch's narrow eyes. The twins hurried back behind the desk and sat down on 2 high-backed chairs. Flint looked at his boots. "I'm sorry I asked you to cover for me when I crept out last night, Lofty." Lofty raised an eyebrow, then he glanced down at his desk. There were about 100 names carved into its surface in columns, and Beside each of the names, there was a spruce cone sitting in a hollowed-out scoop. Lofty picked up a cone from a small wicker basket on the desk and plonked it next to Flint's name. "In," he muttered, "and that's the last time I take the register." Inch coughed and Flint shifted his gaze towards him. "And I'm sorry I made you lie to my sister, Inch." Flint sighed. "It was all going so well at first. I sneaked past the guards, stole into the palace, and then..." He shot a glance at Esker. The novelty of showing her the labyrinth had clearly worn off. "And then she got in the way." Esker felt her cheeks burn. Inch frowned. "What is she?" "A girl," replied Flint. Lofty sighed. "I can see that, but what tribe?" He looked her up and down. "Blue eyes like a tusk, but red hair?" Esker took a tiny step forward. "I'm not a tusk." She felt around for the right words. "Even though I lived in Winterfang Palace, I never once spoke to the Ice Queen. I hate her like you, and..." "You lived at Winterfang Palace?" Lofty spluttered. He turned to Flint. "I'm used to you breaking rules, but asking outsiders from the palace in for a cup of spruce needle tea? What were you thinking?" "I wasn't planning on offering her tea. I was planning on taking her to Tomkin." Inch's eyes widening. "Because he's going to be really pleased to see a Tusk spy." "I'm not a Tusk spy," Esker cried. "Sounds like something a Tusk spy would say," Lofty muttered. Flint drew himself up. "Esker's not a spy. She was the Ice Queen's prisoner, and she knows things Tomkin needs to hear." Inch sank his head into his hands. "This is a disaster." Flint sighed. "Come on, let us through. Blue will be worrying about me." At the mention of Flint's sister, Lofty stood up reluctantly, and Esker noticed something carved into the wood behind where he'd been sitting. The head of an enormous grizzly bear, two small eyes above a snout-like nose, and a wide neck surrounded by a circle of large brown claws. The fur was carved in such detail it almost looked alive, and when Lofty flicked one of the claws beside its ear to the left, all the other claws followed suit. There was a clanking noise like gears slotting into place, and the bear's colossal jaw dropped open. Esker blinked. The way on into the labyrinth was through a grizzly bear's mouth. "Tomkin's in the swingery," Lofty muttered. "They all are." Flint took a step towards the open mouth, but Inch leapt up. "Wait! We should check her for weapons, for ice blades and axes and spears and more ice blades before we let her through." Esker picked at the cuffs of her parka. "I didn't come with anything like that." Flint nodded. "She's unarmed, and besides, she's not the kind of girl who would know how to wield a weapon anyway. Trust me." Lofty glanced at Inch. "Scared of a pathetic little girl? Honestly, I really worry about you with the rebellion coming up." Inch sat down shakily. "I've already asked Tomkin if I can be on register duty." Seizing the opportunity, Flint stole through the bear's mouth and Esker followed. They emerged a moment later before a vast network of wooden walkways and rope ladders, crisscrossing through the canopy of the trees. Esker gasped. How big was this secret world up among the branches? Dotted around the trunks of the spruces were tree houses, about 20 of them in a large circle. Some were square, some rectangular, others oblong or triangular, but each had a door, like shuttered windows, and a chimney on the top. Esker gawped in awe. The forest floor must have been 40 metres below, but she couldn't see it. The trees' branches were so dense, and any gaps between them had been filled with walkways and ladders. And as she looked up, she saw that the branches closed over the hideaway, locking it from sight. Even the birds wouldn't know it was here. Flint slid a glance to Esker behind him, and though he said nothing, she could feel his pride. She hastened after him in towards the centre of this hidden village where the biggest tree house sat. "The swingery," Flint said as they approached it. "This is where we have tribe meetings." It was circular, with a turreted roof made from slats of wood, and, as Flint pulled the door open, Esker held her breath. Tomkin would be inside, and, if she could just persuade him to listen to her, maybe he'd let her stay after all. Hanging from the roof were lots and lots of swings, some simple boards of wood, others slings made from animal hide and hammocks that could hold several people at once, and the floor was scattered with caribou skins. Dozens of children, all clad in brown furs with brown hair and brown eyes, sat on the swings, their heads turned over their shoulders towards Flint and Esker, as if perhaps, just moments before, they'd been listening to someone at the far end of the room. Esker swallowed. The children were staring at her in silence, and their eyes were cold. At the back of the room, a boy stood up on a large swing, hanging from ropes studded with leaves. He flicked a knife up in the air and caught it with one hand. Eska felt her knees wobble. He looked so like Flint, only taller and with a harder jaw. Flint shuffled forward. "Hello, Tomkin." And at his words, Eska felt her hopes drain from her chest, because Tomkin didn't look pleased to see Flint at all. He looked furious. And we're going to leave that there, and we will pick it up tomorrow on Chapter 8. Have a lovely day. Goodbye for now.